I would hope that they would see these people in a peaceful manner. They would not see these poor people trying to find a way to live and survive in a different land as enemies. And I think if we accomplish this thing, we will have much better chance of solving and helping these people.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeffrey Villegas, and you are listening to Insights from Abroad. We are part of the Middle East and South Asia initiatives at the College of Science at the University of Central Florida. Our mission here is to educate, engage, and influence the international community. Today, I am joined by Dr. Hakan Ozoglu to discuss some topics surrounding our Middle East series. Thank you for joining me today.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I've based a few of my questions off of an article that you've written, and so just to kind of introduce where we're going, you as well as the director of our program and some other scholars have worked on a book that basically speaks to the future of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egyptian relations.
Yes.
Part of your chapter in the book talked about Ottoman diplomatic relations and how those transformed and proceeded with the changing scope in the region. Could you tell us a little bit more about your experiences and the studies you did revolving around Ottoman diplomatic relations and the relationships in the region?
Yes, my chapter actually deals with it surveys the history of diplomatic relations between the Ottoman Empire and later Turkey with Saudi Arabia and Egypt. This is a chapter hopefully will introduce the more advanced subjects in the book. And as a historian, what I try to do is give the reader a sense of diplomatic relationship between first the Ottoman Empire until its collapse, and after that the Republican Turkey. As everybody knows, Saudi Arabia came to being as a state in 1930s. When Saudi Arabia became recognized as a nation, the Ottoman Empire was not there anymore. So when we talk about Saudi-Ottoman relations, actually it's a misnomer. We're talking about the Ottoman Empire's relations to the territories that now the Saudi state occupies. The tribes and the Saudi family and the other families, they were there, how the Ottoman state dealt with these tribes and political units of the area. When we come to the Republican period, obviously Turkey and Saudi Arabia established diplomatic relations, and the chapter surveys ups and downs of that time period. And also we do the same thing, I did the same thing for Egypt, starting from the 18th century onwards, again until end of World War I, beginning of World War I. Egypt was nominally an Ottoman territory, but it has its own administration and it has its own history. So Ottoman Empire had perhaps quasi-diplomatic relations with the rulers of Egypt. When the empire collapsed, the administration in Turkey, controlled by the Kemalist or the current regime, and the chapter talks about, actually brings it closer to the year 2000. It's basically a survey of what happened during those times.
So if we reference part of the chapter, how can we compare the atmosphere of 1793 and this realization within the Ottoman Empire that they need to begin to turn outward? They need to begin to build these relationships and to open up these lines of discussion with the surrounding regions.
It's a very good question. The Ottoman Empire, until towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 18th century onwards, did not realize how important it is to have diplomatic representations in different parts of the world. They were declining, and they did not know the reasons for decline. By that time, the Ottoman Empire had many embassies, European embassies, functioning in Constantinople or Istanbul. We see that beginning of the 18th century, they realized that it is important at least to follow the developments of the world or Europe and follow them, and they send representations, diplomatic representations to different European capitals, Paris, London, Vienna, so on and so forth. But the Middle East was not part of it because technically speaking, Middle East, the Saudi Arabia and Egypt, which is the subject, was their territories. What they deal with these territories, especially with Egypt, is that they have governors and they have diplomatic couriers, so to speak. They would send from Istanbul to Cairo and negotiate and talk to people that way. They did not have permanent representation settled in those territories. For the territories, the Arabian Peninsula, there were, as we know in the history of Saudi Arabia, is that prior to the formation of the state, it was governed by an Ottoman governor, which was quite hostile to the Saudi family at that time. The chapter did not go too much into details of those fights and wars between the two, but what it talks about in Saudi Arabia is that they realize that they have to somehow negotiate power with those local tribes. Top of them was the Saudis because they emerged as the most powerful political unit in Arabian Peninsula. The way they negotiated with them was again through their governor. So Istanbul would send a messenger to the governor, and the governor would communicate that with the local tribes. Once the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the new nations like Egypt, Kingdom of Egypt and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was established. It was also the regime in the Ottoman Empire was replaced by the present-day Republican Turkey. Although there were continuation in the foreign the diplomatic relations, the mindset of the diplomats, they had to establish in an equal grounds these groups. What is important for the Turkish side is that when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, during the Ottoman times, Europe and Ottoman Empire, they were exchanging, they were seeing each other on unequal grounds. But they have to change their mindset in a radical way to recognize former Ottoman territories as an equal state so that they can establish diplomatic relations with them. This was an important policy shift in a sense that the Republican Turkey had to establish diplomatic relations and follow the diplomatic guidelines to communicate with the Saudi state and the Egyptian state at that time. Actually, the juiciest part of the chapter, if you will, starts with the Republican period because the Ottomans did not have what we can see as international relations with these territories, simply because this was not an international issue for them. This was a domestic issue, so they were dealing with these territories as a domestic exchange.
Right. Yeah, that's a big shift, right? Recognizing someone as equal.
Yes.
Right. There's a few references to where you can kind of see these instances of either formally acknowledging a leader or not acknowledging. And I'm curious as to how this plays a role. For example, there was a pre-scheduled appointment with an Egyptian ambassador and a Turkish ambassador, and the meeting was denied, and this and that. And so I'm curious as to how these instances and these situations affect foreign policy creation and diplomatic relations in general.
In the largest sense, it did not do too much harm to diplomatic relations, except that there are some cooling periods that these kind of some diplomatic problems emerged. For example, one of which is that when the Nasser regime took over, Turkish diplomat's wife, Turkish ambassador's wife in Cairo, was a family member of the king. So the confiscation of the land and the goods and money of the imperial family in Egypt also affected the Turkish ambassador's pocket, if you will. And then and he was quite objectionable to this affair. And there was one lively debate, for example, that he was invited to talk to Nasser, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And then he was so stern with Nasser, saying that you cannot do this, I cannot shake your hand. In fact, he didn't shake the hands of Nasser. And the next day he was declared persona non grata and he was expelled from Egypt. and that gave the Egyptian-Turkish relations a chill for a while, but they knew that they had to act together. Soon after, the Turkish Republic, Turkish Foreign Ministry, because there were some able diplomats in Turkish Foreign Ministry, were able to amend those kind of chilling situations. There is another example that I mentioned, which was quite interesting. In 1920s, this is before the Nasser period, Turkey was celebrating in Ankara Republican Day, their independence, and in the party, all the diplomats were there, and the Egyptian diplomat was wearing a fez. Now, Mustafa Kemal, hosting the party, just recently changed the law forbidding wearing of fez in Turkey. He took that, Mustafa Kemal took that as an assault to his stand and as a protest of the law that he changed, or the reforms they were called in Turkish Republican history. They say that he knocked Egyptian ambassador's fez down, which caused a lot of controversy. The Egyptian diplomat left, and then there was a formal complaints issued. And Mustafa Kemal, realizing that this was not the way to establish foreign relations, did not come out and apologize publicly, but went personally to the Egyptian embassy in Ankara for the celebration of King's birthday. So that also re-established the relation. So there were periods of this sort between Turkey and Egypt. But no such things during early years of the Republican period took place with the Saudi Arabia, because they were always in the Crown Prince came and visited Turkey, and they issued all the friendly gestures, and they did not really have that kind of so to speak, the problem creating situations with the Saudi Arabia, which is quite interesting because Saudi state is more of an Islamic base than the Egyptian one.
At one point in there, it talks about Egypt, and I believe it's part of one of the treaties, but Egypt makes a formal declaration that they will no longer try to stake a claim on Turkey. Can you explain how Egypt felt like there was a claim?
I think you're referring to the Egyptian Mohammad Ali's one of sons trying to invade Turkish territories militarily, and they were quite successful, coming very close to the Ottoman capital, and the Ottoman state, with the help of the Western powers, were stopped, and they were the Western powers pressured the king that he did not have any desire in the Ottoman territories, and that was an interesting thing that showed how vulnerable the state was. Keep in mind that Egypt was governed by Ottoman governors. Muhammad Ali was not an Arab, actually. He came from Albania, and became the king of Egypt. And there is a statement that once he made. He said that I was not an Arab, but since I lived in here and under the Egyptian sun, I have become an Arab, and so on and so forth. That generation did not even speak Arabic properly. So the rulers, the kingdom, the origin of Egyptian kingdom comes from the Balkans, actually, and there were Ottoman governors. And they were, since they were at the fringes and their relations with Europe was so close, and the Ottoman state in Constantinople or Istanbul was losing blood, the Ottoman Empire was not able to dictate their wishes. For example, Egyptian governors, before they become kings at the end of the Ottoman Empire, were recognized as Ottoman hereditary governors. In the Ottoman administrative structure, this is very rare. The governors always rotate, for the exact same purpose that if they stay in one place long enough, they would somehow declare themselves as the rulers of that state. Whatever they feared happened, and Egypt became, and for that reason, the Ottoman relations with Egypt, and later the Turkish relations with Egypt is quite different than Turkey's relations with Saudi Arabia.
Right. And so maybe you could explain some of those key differences between the two relationships.
The main difference is that the Ottoman state always interacted with a military power which had Western backing in Egypt. Mohammad Ali's government, for example, later his sons interacted, and they modernized the Egyptian state after Europe. So that Egypt's relations with Europe is quite different than Saudi relations with Europe. Now, that gave Egypt an upper hand dealing with the Ottoman or Constantinople or the Sultan in Istanbul, in that they were in a much more advantageous position because they modernized the army, they modernized the modernization process, and the idea of nationalism, all these things entered Egypt much faster than anywhere else in the other Ottoman territories like Iraq or Syria.
Do you think that geography has anything to do with that?
Geography has a lot to do with that because Egypt was close to Europe. And also Europe's expansion policies has a lot to do with that because France and Britain was trying to find alternative routes, as you know, to reach India and Suez Canal, for example. The geography, Egypt was located, it's like the prize of the Ottoman Empire. And another important thing that Europe realized, and then this is in University of Central Florida when we talk about modern Middle East, and the first question I ask, when does the modern period start? Is there any exact date to start the modern Middle East? Where shall we start talking about? It's quite subjective, but I personally start with the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon at the end of the 18th century. The reason for it is that for Europe, Ottoman Empire, they did not test the Ottoman territories. They could attack fringes of the Ottoman Empire in different parts of the huge Ottoman territories in 3 continents. They would take territories, give back territories, but they did not really test how vulnerable the Ottoman state was. When Egypt was invaded at the end of the 18th century by Napoleon's armies, they realized that the Ottoman Empire is a paper tiger. It was quite easy to invade one of the major cities of the empire, Cairo. Cairo was like, after Constantinople, probably one of the most important territories, and then ancient civilization and the waterways and so on and so forth. Of course, the Suez Canal. Keep in mind, this is a very important, at that time, location. This is when the modern period starts, and when the modern, in my opinion, I would suggest, or I would submit, that we should start looking at how the Europe start infiltrating and realizing that the Ottoman Empire is a paper tiger, and they can pull them apart. So European imperialism has a lot to do with Egypt's relations with the Ottoman Empire, later Turkey, but especially with the Ottoman Empire. When Turkey wanted Egypt to do something and Egypt would react to it, Ottoman Empire would go to the Great Britain, for example, as intermediary to put the pressure. So there is a period between diplomatic relations between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire was that the Ottoman Empire bypassed Egypt and then dealt with them if they want something through Great Britain. Saudi Arabia is different. Saudi Arabia emerged as a power that had nothing to do with the European support. Right. In that sense, Saudis, in the Arab eyes, had some standing because they did not collaborate with the imperialists to come to power and betray the Ottoman Empire, so to speak. And Saudi government also, in the eyes of the later Republican diplomats, when we talk about Saudi-Turkish relations, we're basically talking about the Republican period, because when Saudi state emerged, as we talked, there was no more Ottoman Empire. They were dealing with a country that had no Western backing originally, but that comes with the exploration of oil. Right. Americans come to picture after 1930s, but this exploration would have to wait until end of World War II, because the war did not allow the wealth to come out for the Saudi state. And after that, the Turkey also Saudi Arabia entered the international diplomacy through the European channels too. But until the end of World War II, Turkish relations with the Saudi state is quite different than the Egyptian state. They were dealing with them on an so-called equal basis, but again, the attitude in Turkey was always that these were the people who were once our possessions, and we did not do a good job governing them, and it's so expensive and unnecessary to waste our resources to somehow be hostile towards them. It worked quite well for the Saudi state and for Turkey to emphasize this point. For Turkish Republican history, it is important to note that there were discussions that when the new Turkish state emerged as a secular state, the new foreign policy diverted from the Middle East or other Middle Eastern countries and dealt directly with Europe, which is not true. When we look at the history of the relations between these three countries, we see that Turkey also paid attention, quite close attention to their relations with both Saudi and the Egyptian states. So we know that they were sending diplomats, and Saudis were sending diplomats to Istanbul too, and they were trying to somehow be on a level, if not friendly, but at least not hostile towards each other. Saudis never, until very recently, obviously everybody knows what the recent developments between Turkish and Saudi relations. Until then, there was not a major problem between the two countries, in the sense that Turkey and Egypt had problems from time to time. But at the present, the book probably will talk about other chapters of other writers will talk about specific ones in specific time periods. I just wanted to give the background of these discussions in this chapter so that people would better understand and grasp the underlying dynamics where how we come to this point between among these relations, international relations of these countries.
And it does a great job of bringing people up to speed, bringing them to why we're here, where we're at today. And so could you make any statements about where you think we're going, or what developments need to happen to keep peaceful relations?
I keep saying this whenever people ask me these questions. Historians are very touchy about making predictions about future, because they know that whatever predictions are made more than likely will fail to substantiate. In the Middle East, things are changing in an amazing speed, very rapid speed. The international involvement in the region is also very heavy compared to the earlier time periods. There are many actors, international and regional actors, involved in this power sharing politics. There are so many unknowns and so many variables that the wind can blow any which direction. It can change anything in a very substantial level. For example, if you ask someone 10 years ago Turkish-Saudi relations would be in this stage, they would not predict this would be possible, but it is possible. So it is possible that Turkish-Saudi relations would come to a more understanding nature, and they establish themselves in a more understanding, not hostile manner. But it is quite possible that it can sour depending on all these unknown dynamics that can come into play. Especially when we have oil, we don't know what other sources and other intrigues or conspiracies. There are a lot of things boiling underground that I don't think neither Saudi Arabia nor Turkey nor United States nor Great Britain knows.
What would you say are some of the mechanisms to support these open communication channels? Are they there? What can we do to increase cooperation, if you will?
Well, even if at a diplomatic level the relations are cold, underground, if you will, or not very visible, people are talking. Informal talks are taking place. But again, it's all the leaders can come out and preach one way, but we know that the reality could be quite different. And what we don't know between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, for example, at what level and what the United States position to keep Turkey and Saudi Arabia relations together. The superpowers like United States have the potential to interfere with these relations if they wish to do so. We see that in Venezuela, for example, they can be quite active and actively involved in doing so. My understanding is that these channels, not very visible, are still interacting, communicating. All these countries have shared interest being in the Middle East and dealing with the other issues. But there is also regional power struggle, especially among these three countries. Saudis wanted to be the regional powers, and with the wealth they have, support certain actions and movements that Turkey does not approve. Egypt is the same way. Egypt is an amazing military, huge military spending and support from United States. And Turkey, as I said, historically claimed to be a major regional power. Of course, what we can add to this is Iran. Iran is also a very important player. And Iran is a Shiite country, and as a major, in terms of ideology, if you will, major rival to the Ottoman Empire. But Russia is in it, United States is in it, God knows China probably is in it too. So all these powers, the diplomacy in this region now is like walking in a tightrope in a very windy weather without that balancing stick.
Are there lessons from historically, from the Ottoman Empire's realization that they need to turn outward, from the relationships and how they've progressed? Can we take any lessons from history and apply them to now?
Yes. I think number one thing I can say is that it is unpredictable. International relations, there is no permanent enemies or permanent friends.
Good point.
It changes constantly. So when we realize that, and we see that these diplomatic relations are so tense, Turkish diplomatic relations at the present is quite tense with Egypt too, but there are signs that it is changing. So history tells us that don't make predictions. Anything can happen.
For sure. And so what do you think you would like to see in the region for yourself and for?
Well, I mean, it's peace and prosperity. Obviously, it's quite important. The Middle East has been suffering a long time, and when we say suffering, we don't see much in the United States, but people on the streets, millions of people are uprooted from their lands in Syria, for example, and in Iraq, not to mention those who died. And it is one of the saddest moments of the Middle East. I can safely state that. Since World War I do not see, as a historian, any other time period, including World War II. I don't see any other moment that Middle East was this much in bloodshed and suffrage and suffering of civilians.
Is there anything that either the listeners or people here or around the world can do to support, like, the people on the ground, the people who are affected the most?
There are a lot of NGOs that they should educate themselves. There are many people, for example, in Turkey, I know there are a lot of NGOs trying to help out these people who lost their family members and come to a foreign country whose language they are not very familiar with, in Europe too. So if nothing else, if they cannot be supportive in terms of financing these things, I would hope that they would see these people in a peaceful manner. They would not see these poor people trying to find a way to live and survive in a different land as enemies. I would hope that they would see these refugees of different countries, they see them as human beings whose desires were not any different than people in the United States. And I think if we accomplish this thing, we will have much better chance of solving and helping these people. It can happen to anyone. It's not just the Middle East. Syria would never think 20 years ago this would happen. Forget about 10 years ago this would happen. It can happen. History tells that it does happen. So I think we need to educate people what happened in history, that this is not just a Middle Eastern issue. Anytime these issues can come up and hurt the people. And I would hope that this would be my message. Please do not see these people as someone from Mars. These are human beings looking for ways to live.
Right. To recognize the humanity.
Exactly.
And to not see them as other, but as equal.
Exactly.
So, what are you currently working on? What are your interests now and going forward? Where are you at?
Currently, I'm trying to finish up a book. I'm on sabbatical. I actually am now located in Istanbul, trying to finish a book on an American diplomat and his tenure in the Ottoman Empire and later Turkey. And the subject is quite interesting. I would say that I'm looking at the WikiLeaks documents of 1920s, 1910s. The secret documents. Now they're open to public, obviously. So I'm looking at how the American diplomats were observing the rise of the Middle East and rise of the modern Middle East and Turkey and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And hopefully I'll be done by the end of 2019 and publish it.
Do you see? Can you give us any sneak peeks? Anything that you see that really stands out to you now?
Yes, I can. For example, the Kemalist regime, and they were observing that it has been presented that the Kemalists were anti-religious, and because they abolished the caliphate, the office of the caliphate in 1924. One document stands out saying that before they abolished the caliphate, they asked a North African sheikh, they offered the position to them, to this person.
Wow.
So this is a very important finding, and I see no reason to doubt that happened. We have the communication between the American ambassador or the high commissioner at that time and the secretary of the sheikh. If this is true, which I believe it is, that means that the Kemalists were not that hostile towards the caliphate, the office of the caliphate, and not that anti-religious. So
that would definitely put a different perspective on it.
Very different perspective. So hopefully when the book comes out, this would create a different angle to look at the issue and create debate. Obviously in history, we don't find the truth. Actually, we find documents to interpret what we think the truth is until the next document comes up. And we have to recognize that.
Very good point. Excellent. So for anybody listening, and if they were inspired by your talk and they wanted to reach out to you, how could they get a hold of you?
If they go to, my name is Hakan Ozoglu, Ozoglu. If they type my name, and they're going to see that I'm the director of Middle Eastern Studies, UCF, and there is a contact information. They can send me emails. We can communicate. No hate mails, please.
Right. Well, thank you for your wisdom and your insights on this.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you.
I appreciate you spending your time with us. So if you want to learn more about today's guests, our mission, or our program, you can visit us at the PMBF website, which you can find at UCF, or you can follow any of our social media pages, be it LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. And so for the Middle East and Southeast Asia Studies program here at UCF, this is Jeffrey Villegas. Thank you for listening.
I would